And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Well, tonight's weather, low pressure here in the southern Gulf of Alaska starts to push some wind and rain in toward the southeast coast late tonight. Light winds and diminishing showers with clearing over the interior. Some damp conditions continue for Bristol Bay and Kodiak, and a weakening front spreads some light rain up toward the Pribilofs and into the eastern Aleutians. For tomorrow, that front holds together enough to bring some light rain into the western Alaska Peninsula up to St. Paul and St. George. Low pressure keeps it wet out over the western Aleutians. And again, some isolated showers on the increase throughout the mid or late morning and afternoon hours here in the interior. Other areas seeing a pretty good amount of sunshine and just a chance of rain for the North Gulf Coast here to Kodiak Island. Periods of rain for the Panhandle. And that front moves through, another one develops here as the low center kind of pulls back to the west a little bit there. So some rain and showers for the North Gulf Coast. Again, warmer here in the central and eastern interior, especially in the Yukon Flats, eastern and Tanana Valley areas, well into the 70s for the first day of June. And scattered showers back here to the west, and really nothing going on. Pretty quiet out over the Bering Sea and the Aleutians. And for the coastal water forecast here for the southeast coast, on the south coast of the southeast coast, southeast winds 25 knots, east winds 30 to 35 knots. For the central coast and the north coast, easterlies 20 to 25 knots. Southeast 25 knot winds in the forecast for Clarence Strait. Otherwise, Stevens Passage southeast of 15. On up to the north there, Lynn Canal northeast 15 knots. For Saturday, southeast winds 15 knots for all the inside water areas. Otherwise, south winds 15 to 20 knots for the south coast. Southeast 20 to 25 knots there for the central coast, and the north coast a little bit stronger. Small craft advisories, southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Prince William Sound northeasterlies at 15 for the day Friday. Cook Inlet northeast 20 knots for northern Cook Inlet. And northeast 25 knots, so small craft advisories, southern Cook Inlet, small crafts also for Kamishak Bay. Northeast winds 25 knots. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands, western North Gulf Coast. Northeasterlies at 35 knots, seas around 10 feet. East-northeast 30 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. And Prince William Sound, north of the stronger winds there, so looking northeast at about 15 knots with 3-foot seas. Then on Saturday, those stronger winds shift up into Prince William Sound, so we're looking at small craft advisories, east winds 25 knots with 6-foot seas. North Gulf Coast, Barren Islands, east-northeast winds 30 knots. Kamishak Bay, southern Cook Inlet, north at 15. Northern Cook Inlet, northeasterlies at 15 knots. Kodiak Island, north winds 35 knots. Northeast 25 for Shelikof Strait, and the Alaska Peninsula east to southeast winds of 15 to 20 knots. Bristol Bay east winds 15 knots. Outlook for Saturday. Alaska Peninsula light variable winds at about 10 knots with seas 2 to 5 feet. Bristol Bay east winds at 10 knots with slight seas. Kodiak Island small craft advisories, north to northeast winds at 25 knots, seas running 6 to 9 feet. Eastern Aleutians, on Alaska Island, southeast winds, 20 to 25 knots. Nikolsky area, southwest at 20. Adak and Atka, southwest winds 25 knots. And then south to southwest winds here turn kind of variable there. West at 35 knots for the western Aleutians. And then Saturday, north winds to west-northwesterlies for the areas west of Adak, anywhere from 15 to 25 knots. Adak and Atka, west winds at 15 knots. Eastern Aleutians, light variable winds at 10 knots. And for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, east winds 20 knots. North of Nunivak Island, east winds at 10 knots. St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound, east winds 15 knots. Strongest winds will be over the Pribilof Islands out of the east at 25 knots. St. Matthew Island, east at 20 knots. And then for Saturday, light variable winds for the Pribilofs, seas still around 6 feet, northeast at 25 with 9-foot seas for St. Matthew Island. Light northeast breeze here for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. And then heading up north, Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, north winds at 20 knots. And for the central and eastern Arctic coast here, variable winds 5 to 10 knots, brisk wind advisories, small craft advisories now that the ice is gone here for the western Arctic coast at 25 knots, all the way down to Point Hope, Chuck CC, light winds out of the south at 10 knots. And then the outlook for Saturday, pretty brisk northerly winds here for the Chuck CC up to 25 knots with seas running 5 feet, north at 15 for the western Arctic coast, and winds still light and variable, mostly onshore though for the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast, running anywhere from 5 to 15 knots.